The snow had not yet fallen on Lexington Green, but the air carried the weight of something far heavier than winter. Just before dawn on April 19, 1775, the ground beneath Massachusetts trembled, not from cannons or marching armies, but from a quiet, irreversible decision. Farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, and shopkeepers stood with muskets in trembling hands, facing the most powerful empire the world had ever known. None of them could fully grasp it yet, but history had already crossed a point of no return. In that moment, the United States of America, though not yet named, not yet born, began to breathe. This is not the story of statues or slogans. This is the story of fear, ambition, betrayal, courage, greed, ideals, blood, and belief. This is the story of how 13 fragile colonies, divided by class, religion, slavery, and self-interest, somehow forged a nation that would one day reshape the entire world. But to understand that morning in Lexington, we must go back much further, back before the musket smoke, before the slogans of liberty, before anyone dared whisper the word independence. We must begin with hunger. In the early 1600s, the land that would one day be called America was not an idea, it was an unknown, untamed reality. Dense forests swallowed sunlight, rivers ran wild and wide. Indigenous nations had lived here for thousands of years, governed by systems older than most European kingdoms. They had laws, diplomacy, trade routes, wars, and peace treaties long before a single European ship touched the shore. Europe, however, was suffocating. England was gripped by religious conflict, economic despair, and political violence. Land was scarce, power was concentrated, opportunity belonged only to the few. For the poor, the faithful outsider, or the ambitious younger son, the future felt sealed shut. Across the Atlantic, rumors spread like wildfire. A land where soil was free, where a man could own what he worked, where God could be worshipped without fear. Some came chasing faith, others came chasing gold, many came running from death. In 1607, along the marshy banks of the James River, England planted its first permanent foothold, Jamestown. What followed was not glory, it was starvation. The settlers were unprepared, divided, and dangerously arrogant. They underestimated the land, misunderstood its seasons, and dismissed indigenous knowledge. Disease tore through them, food vanished, winter became an executioner. By the winter of 1609, desperation consumed Jamestown. Historical records describe men eating rats, leather, and even the dead. The starving time nearly erased England's American dream before it could begin. Yet Jamestown survived, not because it was noble, but because it was profitable. Tobacco changed everything. John Rolfe's successful cultivation of tobacco transformed Virginia into an economic engine. Land suddenly meant wealth. Wealth demanded labor, and labor, cheap, controllable labor, became the colony's darkest foundation. At first, that labor came from indentured servants, poor Europeans who sold years of their lives in exchange for passage across the ocean. But indentured servitude had limits. Servants survived their contracts. They demanded land. They rebelled. So the system evolved into something far more permanent: slavery. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia carrying African captives. Their arrival did not immediately create a racial caste system, but it planted the seed of one. Over decades, laws hardened, skin color became destiny, human beings became property. The contradiction at the heart of America was born the same moment America itself began to form. Further north, a very different experiment was unfolding. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, not conquerors, but survivors. They sought not riches, but religious autonomy. Their world revolved around covenant between God, community, and law. Before stepping ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a radical idea for its time, that government derived its authority from the consent of the governed. It was fragile, it was incomplete, but it mattered. New England grew into a society shaped by education, town meetings, and moral discipline. Harvard College was founded in 1636, decades before many European cities had public schools. Literacy flourished, not for profit, but for scripture. Yet this society, too, carried darkness. Religious freedom applied only to the faithful. Dissenters were banished. Native lands were seized. Conflicts like King Philip's War drenched the soil in blood, devastating indigenous populations and reshaping power forever. By the early 1700s, the American colonies were no longer an experiment, they were an ecosystem. 13 colonies, different economies, different religions, different social structures. Virginia was aristocratic and enslaved. Massachusetts was moral and communal. Pennsylvania was pluralistic and commercial. The Carolinas were plantation empires. What united them was not identity, but distance. An ocean separated them from Britain, and in that distance, something dangerous grew: autonomy. For decades, Britain barely noticed. The colonies governed themselves, they taxed themselves, they defended themselves. British authority existed mostly on paper. Colonists began to think of themselves not as subjects, but as something else. Then came war. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, was the turning point. Britain defeated France and claimed vast new territories in North America, but victory came at a crushing cost: debt. London looked westward and saw the solution: tax the colonies. The colonists saw something else. They saw betrayal. They had fought, they had died, and now, without representation in Parliament, they were expected to pay. The slogan spread like wildfire: no taxation without representation. At first, resistance was cautious, legal, respectful. Then Britain doubled down. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Each law tightened the noose. Protests turned into riots. Boycotts turned into defiance. Defiance turned into ideology. By the time tea was dumped into Boston Harbor, it was no longer about taxes. It was about power. And power, once challenged, never retreats quietly. As British troops marched into Boston, occupying a city that no longer wanted them, fear spread through the colonies. Not fear of Britain's strength, but fear of what resistance might unleash. Because rebellion is a fire that consumes more than empires. It consumes certainty, it consumes lives, and sometimes it consumes the very ideals that ignited it. The colonies stood at the edge of history, unaware that within a single generation they would declare independence, fracture in civil war, expand across a continent, enslave millions, free them, rise as a global superpower, and wrestle endlessly with the meaning of their own promises. But to understand that morning in Lexington, we must go back much further, back before the musket smoke, before the slogans of liberty, before anyone dared whisper the word independence. We must begin with hunger. No one knows who pulled the trigger first. That uncertainty has echoed through American history like a ghost that refuses to rest. On Lexington Green, as the sun struggled to rise through the mist, about 70 colonial militiamen stood facing more than 700 British regulars. The redcoats were disciplined, trained, confident. The colonists were tired, cold, and afraid. They had been told to stand their ground, but not to fire. A British officer shouted an order. Someone moved. A musket cracked the silence. Then the world exploded. Within seconds, gunfire tore through the green, smoke blurred faces, men screamed. When it ended, 8 colonists lay dead. The British marched on toward Concord, believing they had crushed a minor disturbance. They were wrong. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial resistance hardened. This time, the militia fired deliberately. British soldiers fell, and as the Redcoats retreated back toward Boston, farmers and townspeople lined the roads, firing behind trees, stone walls, and barns. It was not a formal battle. It was something far more terrifying to an empire. It was a people rising. By nightfall, nearly 300 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The myth of British invincibility had shattered in a single day. News traveled fast, faster than armies. Within weeks, militias from all 13 colonies mobilized. They did not yet call themselves Americans. They still spoke of loyalty to the king, but their actions told a different story. Boston was surrounded, British troops were trapped, and war, whether desired or not, had begun. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress gathered under a cloud of fear and hope. The men inside Independence Hall were not revolutionaries by nature. Many were wealthy landowners, lawyers, and merchants. They had much to lose. John Adams burned with defiance. Samuel Adams whispered rebellion. John Dickinson pleaded for reconciliation. And George Washington, tall, silent, painfully aware of his own limits, was chosen to command an army that barely existed. Washington did not seek the role. He accepted it because he believed no one else could hold the colonies together. The Continental Army was a nightmare. No uniforms, no steady pay, no discipline, no supplies. Men deserted constantly. Officers argued. States refused to cooperate. Washington spent more time begging Congress for food and gunpowder than planning battles. Across the ocean, Britain prepared to crush the rebellion. They underestimated one thing: time. The first year of war was chaos. In June 1775, colonial forces attacked British positions at Bunker Hill. They lost the hill, but proved they could stand against professional soldiers. The cost shocked Britain, over 1,000 casualties. Washington arrived in Boston soon after and turned a mob into an army, slowly, painfully. By March 1776, British forces evacuated Boston. It looked like a victory. It was not. The British shifted their focus to New York, landing tens of thousands of troops, the largest military force the colonies had ever seen. Washington's army collapsed under pressure. Defeat followed defeat. Retreat followed retreat. By December 1776, the revolution was dying. Morale was gone. Enlistments expired. The cause seemed lost. Thomas Paine captured the moment perfectly. These are the times that try men's souls. On Christmas night, with ice cutting through flesh and boots soaked in blood, Washington made a decision that would define him forever. He crossed the Delaware River. In a surprise attack on Trenton, Washington struck Hessian mercenaries sleeping in their quarters. The victory was small, but its impact was enormous. It proved the revolution still breathed. Yet even as the war raged, something else was happening, something far more dangerous than British cannons. Ideas were spreading. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. It was not polite. It was not cautious. It was explosive. Paine attacked monarchy itself, calling it unnatural, corrupt, and absurd. He did what leaders feared to do. He said the word out loud: independence. The pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Farmers read it. Sailors read it. Women read it aloud to families. The psychological break was complete. By summer of 1776, reconciliation was impossible. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, they approved the words that would define a nation. The Declaration of Independence was not merely a breakup letter, it was a philosophical weapon. All men are created equal. Those words rang with dangerous promise. They did not describe reality, they challenged it. Thomas Jefferson wrote of natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while owning enslaved human beings. The contradiction was enormous. The consequences would last centuries. On January 8th, the Declaration was read aloud in public squares. Some cheered, some wept, some remained silent, knowing what this meant. This was no longer rebellion, this was treason. If the colonies lost, the signers would hang. The war dragged on, brutal and uncertain. The British captured New York, Philadelphia fell. Winter at Valley Forge nearly destroyed the Continental Army. Men froze, starved, died. Washington stayed. He shared their suffering, walking among tents, refusing comfort others lacked. His presence mattered more than any victory. Slowly, painfully, the army hardened. Then, in 1777, everything changed. At Saratoga, American forces defeated a British army marching south from Canada. The victory stunned Europe. France, Britain's ancient rival, saw opportunity. In 1778, France entered the war on America's side. What began as a colonial rebellion became a global conflict. Spain followed. The Netherlands joined indirectly. Britain was stretched thin. Still, victory was not guaranteed. The war shifted south. Brutality increased. Loyalists and patriots slaughtered one another. Slavery became a weapon, with the British promising freedom to enslaved people who fled rebel masters. The Revolution exposed its deepest hypocrisies. By 1781, exhaustion gripped all sides. Then came Yorktown. British General Cornwallis, trapped by American and French forces, surrendered his army. It was not the end of fighting, but it was the end of hope for Britain. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States. Against all odds, a fragile republic had survived. But independence was only the beginning. The war had united the colonies, but peace would test them even more severely. Because winning freedom is easier than governing it. And the young nation was about to discover just how fragile its victory truly was. Victory did not feel like triumph. When the guns finally fell silent in 1783, the United States of America existed on paper, but barely anywhere else. The war had ended, yet the country it created was fragile, exhausted, and deeply uncertain about its own future. Cities lay in ruin. The economy was shattered. Soldiers returned home unpaid, bitter and broken. And the government that had won independence was almost powerless. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was not truly a nation. It was a loose alliance of sovereign states, suspicious of one another and terrified of centralized power. Congress could not tax, it could not regulate trade, it could not enforce its own laws, it could barely survive. Each state printed its own money. Trade wars erupted between neighbors. Foreign nations mocked the new republic, doubting it would last a decade. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, watched in silence as chaos crept in. He had resigned his commission voluntarily, an act so rare that King George III reportedly called it the greatest character act of the age. Washington could have seized power. He did not. But restraint alone would not save the nation. The crisis came from the people who had fought the war. In western Massachusetts, farmers faced foreclosure and imprisonment for unpaid debts. Many were veterans, men who had bled for independence only to be crushed by economic despair. In 1786, under the leadership of Daniel Shays, armed men shut down courts and challenged the authority of the state. Shays' rebellion terrified the political elite. To them, it was not merely unrest, it was a warning. If the government could not maintain order, the republic would collapse into anarchy, or worse, it would invite tyranny as a desperate solution. Washington was convinced. So were James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Something had to change. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. In reality, they intended to replace them entirely. Behind closed doors, in sweltering heat, 55 men debated the future of the American experiment. Windows were shut, guards stood watch, secrecy was absolute. The stakes were enormous. Too much power, and the revolution would be betrayed. Too little, and the nation would disintegrate. The Constitution emerged from compromise, fear, and ambition. Large states demanded representation by population. Small states demanded equality. Slave states demanded protection. Free states demanded limits. The result was a document filled with brilliant ideas and profound moral failures. Slavery was not abolished. Women were excluded. Native nations were ignored. Yet the framework was revolutionary. Separation of powers, checks and balances, a government strong enough to function, but constrained enough to fear its own citizens. When the Constitution was released, the nation erupted in debate. Supporters, the Federalists, argued it was necessary for survival. Opponents, the Anti-Federalists, warned it would destroy liberty. The ratification battle was fierce. Only after the promise of a Bill of Rights, explicit protections for individual freedoms, did enough states agree. In 1788, the Constitution was ratified. The Republic took its first true breath. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. He did not rule as a king, he did not speak often, but every action he took set a precedent that would echo for centuries. He built a cabinet, not a court. He stepped down after 2 terms, cementing the idea that power must be temporary. He warned against political parties, even as they formed around him. Alexander Hamilton envisioned a strong federal government, national banks, and industrial growth. Thomas Jefferson imagined an agrarian republic of independent farmers, wary of centralized power. Their rivalry defined the nation's first political divide. And beneath it all, the contradictions deepened. The nation spoke of liberty while enslaving millions. It celebrated freedom while pushing native nations westward. It claimed equality while denying half the population a voice. America was not collapsing, it was expanding, and expansion would test every promise it had made. As the 19th century dawned, the United States turned west. Land meant opportunity. Opportunity demanded conquest. Through purchases, treaties, and war, the nation pushed beyond the Appalachians, then the Mississippi, and beyond. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's size overnight, an act that contradicted Jefferson's own strict interpretation of the Constitution. But power rarely waits for consistency. With land came conflict. Native American nations resisted removal. The federal government responded with force and policy. Under Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act led to the Trail of Tears, a death march that killed thousands and scarred the nation's conscience. At the same time, slavery expanded with the land. Every new territory reopened the same question: free or slave? Compromises delayed the inevitable, but delay is not resolution. By the 1850s, the United States was a house divided. Economic systems clashed, moral visions collided, violence erupted in Kansas. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1660, Southern states chose secession. They believed the Union no longer served them. They believed slavery must be protected. They believed they could walk away. They were wrong. The Civil War would become the deadliest conflict in American history, a war that would decide whether the nation born in 1776 would survive and whether its founding words meant anything at all. And when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, America stepped into its darkest trial. On April 12, 1861, as dawn broke over Charleston Harbor, cannons thundered against Fort Sumter. The United States was no longer arguing. It was at war with itself. Men who had grown up under the same flag now aimed rifles at one another. Families split, churches fractured, states chose sides. The question that had been postponed for generations could no longer be avoided. Was the United States a single, indivisible nation, or a temporary agreement that could be abandoned when inconvenient? Abraham Lincoln understood the danger more clearly than anyone. He had not sought war. He had not promised abolition. He had promised only to preserve the Union. But history rarely allows leaders to choose the battles they fight. The early years of the Civil War were chaos. The Union had industry, population, and railroads. The Confederacy had experienced generals, unity of purpose, and the belief that they were defending their way of life. Battles were bloody and inconclusive. Bull Run shattered illusions of a quick victory. Antietam drowned fields in blood. Casualties mounted beyond imagination. Soldiers wrote letters home describing horrors that words could barely carry. Limbs torn apart, screams echoing through smoke, boys dying far from home. Lincoln aged rapidly. He faced generals who failed him, critics who despised him, and a nation losing patience. Yet beneath the pressure, his thinking evolved. He came to see what the war truly was. It was not merely about preserving the Union, it was about redefining it. In 1863, after the carnage at Antietam gave him political cover, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, it did not end slavery everywhere, but it transformed the war. The Union was now fighting not only for survival, but for freedom. Enslaved men fled plantations. Black soldiers joined the Union Army. Foreign powers hesitated to support the Confederacy. The moral axis of the war shifted. Still, victory remained uncertain. The turning point came in July 1863. At Gettysburg, over 3 days of relentless combat, the Union stopped General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. More than 50,000 men fell. Soon after, Union forces captured Vicksburg, splitting the Confederacy in two. The tide had turned. Yet the war dragged on, brutal and unforgiving. General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through the South, destroying infrastructure and morale. His strategy was clear: break the Confederacy's will to fight. In April 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered. The Civil War was over. The Union had survived. Slavery had been destroyed. But peace was fragile and fleeting. Just days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation plunged into grief. The man who might have guided reconciliation was gone. What followed was Reconstruction, an unfinished revolution. Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and promised equal protection under the law. For a brief moment, the United States stood on the brink of true transformation. Black Americans voted, held office, built institutions. Then came backlash. White supremacist violence surged. Federal commitment faded. Reconstruction collapsed. By the end of the 19th century, segregation, disenfranchisement, and racial terror had replaced hope. The war had ended. The struggle had not. Meanwhile, America surged forward. Railroads stitched the continent together.
Immigrants flooded cities, factories roared to life. The United States became an industrial giant, rich, powerful, unequal. Workers toiled in brutal conditions, robber barons amassed unimaginable wealth, labor movements rose and were crushed. The nation that had fought a war for freedom now wrestled with its meaning in an age of machines. By the early 20th century, the United States stepped onto the world stage. It fought in World War I, then retreated into isolation. It collapsed into the Great Depression, then rebuilt itself through the New Deal. It emerged from World War II as a global superpower. Yet old contradictions remained. Freedom abroad, inequality at home. The civil rights movement would challenge those contradictions once again, forcing America to confront promises it had made centuries earlier. The United States was never a finished project. It was a constant argument between ideals and reality, between who it claimed to be and who it actually was. And that argument would shape every generation that followed.
When the 20th century arrived, the United States was no longer a fragile republic clinging to survival. It was becoming a force. Factories thundered day and night. Steel, oil, and electricity reshaped daily life. Immigrants poured through Ellis Island, carrying languages, religions, and hopes that collided inside crowded cities. Skyscrapers rose where farms once stood. America was reinventing itself at a speed that left many behind. And then the world caught fire. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, dragged in by submarine warfare and global economics. President Woodrow Wilson spoke of making the world safe for democracy. Yet at home, dissent was crushed, free speech narrowed, and racial violence exploded. The war ended, but peace proved unstable. America retreated inward, refusing to join the League of Nations, sealing borders, and embracing isolation. Prosperity followed, dazzling and uneven. The 1920s glittered with jazz, automobiles, and consumer credit, while beneath the surface, inequality and speculation grew dangerously. In 1929, the illusion shattered. The Great Depression collapsed banks, erased savings, and threw millions into desperation. Breadlines stretched through cities. Farms failed. Families broke apart under hunger and hopelessness. The American system itself seemed on trial. Franklin Roosevelt responded not with retreat, but reinvention. The New Deal expanded the role of government, offering jobs, regulation, and social safety nets. It did not end suffering, but it reshaped the relationship between citizens and the state. For the first time, many Americans expected government not just to protect borders, but to protect lives. Then came another war. World War II consumed the globe, and this time the United States could not stand aside. After Pearl Harbor, the nation mobilized with staggering speed. Factories became arsenals. Women entered industrial work in unprecedented numbers. Science fused with warfare, producing technologies that would redefine power. The war ended in victory, but at a terrible cost. The Holocaust revealed the depths of human cruelty. The atomic bomb revealed the terrifying reach of human ingenuity. When the smoke cleared, the United States stood as a superpower, rich, armed, and influential beyond anything its founders had imagined. But power brought new dangers. The Cold War turned fear into policy. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other across ideological lines, threatening global annihilation. Nuclear weapons made total war unthinkable and constant tension unavoidable. At home, fear bred conformity. The Red Scare destroyed careers. Loyalty was questioned. Freedom bent under suspicion. Yet resistance grew elsewhere. Black Americans, veterans of a war for freedom, returned home unwilling to accept second-class citizenship. The contradiction was unbearable. How could America claim moral leadership while denying basic rights to millions? The civil rights movement rose not from chaos, but from courage. Rosa Parks refused to move. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of dreams deferred. Students faced dogs, fire hoses, and bullets with nonviolent defiance. The nation watched itself on television and could no longer look away. Civil rights legislation passed. Voting rights expanded. Legal segregation collapsed. But equality remained incomplete. The late 20th century tested America again. Vietnam shattered faith in leadership. Watergate exposed corruption at the highest level. Economic shifts hollowed out industrial communities. Yet the nation endured, arguing, reforming, redefining. The Cold War ended without nuclear catastrophe. Technology reshaped communication and power. Globalization tied America's fate to the world. Through triumph and failure, one truth remained constant. The United States was never defined by perfection. It was defined by struggle. At its core, American history is not a straight line. It is a collision between ideals and interests, freedom and fear, hope and hypocrisy. From Lexington Green to Gettysburg, from Selma to the moon, the nation has moved forward not because it was flawless, but because people believed it could be better. That belief, fragile, contested, unfinished, is the true inheritance of the United States, not a promise fulfilled, but a promise continually demanded. And the story, like the nation itself, is still being written.